Okay, welcome back, geographers. If you are sitting your exams on the 12th of May, you need to listen up because the next video is about to take you through the Tectonics essential earthquake case studies. To hit the top levels of the mark scheme, you need to be impressing the examiners with your AO1 case study knowledge. And every year, examiners continue to report that students continue to rely too much on Haiti and Tohoku. So what this video is designed to do is give you a range of case study ideas around Haiti and Tohoku, but also give you those ways of thinking about evaluative points by being quite case study led with place context examples. So first up, we'll start with Chile. Chile's a great place to start with because it's one of the first examples that you're introduced to where the plate boundary type can be a reason for increased vulnerability. Chile sits on a convergent boundary where you've got the Nazca Plate and the South American Plate. The Nazca Plate subducts beneath the South American Plate because it is the oceanic plate, which is more dense, thus creating a massive Benioff zone, and as we know, fractures can occur at any point along the line of subduction, normally here, which creates a shallow focal depth earthquake. Now, because of this tectonic setting, Chile frequently experiences high magnitude earthquakes, and in 1960 this interaction of the plate resulted in magnitude 9.5 earthquake, the largest ever recorded, and this resulted in 1,600 deaths. But why Chile is always a great example is because despite this high magnitude setting, it's been able to overcome these high magnitude risks by developing systems of governance within which they can increase their resilience. So fast forward to February 2010 when there was an 8.8 magnitude earthquake. Enormous. The physical energy released was immense. The disaster scale was mitigated by development. Total economic losses were still around 30 billion, which was around 17 to 18% of Chile's GDP at the time. Despite this though, the death toll was kept to only 525, which represents a huge improvement from the 1,600 deaths in 1960. And that was down to the strict building codes that were implemented post 1960. Fast forward again to 2015, another high magnitude earthquake of 8.3, which resulted in only 15 to 25 deaths. This again was a result of Chile's heavy investment in their National Emergency Office, creating a network of 24/7 sensors which give people enough warning to evacuate. So during this earthquake, they effectively evacuated over 1 million people, and going forward spend around 2.1% of their national budget on disaster risk reduction. So Chile is the perfect example there of where, yes, magnitude can be significant in economic losses, but in terms of social losses, governance and development can be more important. Okay, next up, Gujarat, India. Okay, so before we hit the next case study, I want to make sure that you're actually ready to put these facts into an exam style answer. We're officially in the exam technique phase for paper 1 of my revision program. So if you're panicking about how to structure a 12 marker, a 6 marker, a 3 marker, a 20 marker, or how to evaluate governance versus magnitude, what's the exact wording that you need to use to make sure that you're getting that top level response, I've got you covered. Now, you've missed the first few sessions, but don't worry, every session's recorded. You'll get full access to all my resources, which include PowerPoints, level 3 and 4 model answers, and my custom-built AI writing coaches, powered by Google Gemini. So these are designed to specifically help you draft high tariff mark responses and perfect your AO2 evaluation skills, and they will give you that immediate feedback on something that you write. It's $39.99 for that total security before the exams, which, as we know, start on May the 12th. That's less than the cost of a private tutoring session. Just to put that into perspective. Sessions take place on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday mornings. So if you're keen to lock in that high grade, send me a quick email if you want to know more, or click the link in my bio to sign up right now. Okay, commercial break over. Let's move on to a case study that examiners love because it's so unique. Gujarat 2001 and the dangers of intraplate earthquakes. Now let's say that you've just made a point that the people that are most at risk are the people that are right next to the plate boundary. You'd be correct, but not always. Gujarat, India in 2001 is a really good wildcard example, and this is because it is an intraplate earthquake that has resulted in more deaths than quite a few of the close proximity to plate boundary earthquakes. In January 2001, a 7.7 magnitude intraplate earthquake hit Gujarat. It wasn't on the boundary, it was hundreds of kilometers away. This was caused by the reactivation of ancient rifts and faults within the Indian plate. The focal depth was extremely shallow, around 16 kilometers, and this meant that seismic energy didn't have a great distance over which to dissipate. But the real disaster here was the lack of preparedness. Because the area wasn't considered high risk, being quite far away from a plate boundary, there was zero hazard resistant design, resulting in 90% of the buildings collapsing. Because of this, there were over 20,000 deaths, 166,000 injuries, and economic losses were around 4.5 billion. So this is the classic case of high vulnerability due to a low frequency of hazard, meaning that the government forgot they was even a risk. So if you're referencing the tectonic as a profile and looking at that idea of frequency, then you can say that low frequency can equal high risk, and Gujarat is your perfect example. Okay, next up is Nepal 2015. Nepal 2015 is going to be one of the most useful case studies for you in the exam because there's a range of factors that you can discuss. As a consequence, it's a really good one to use with the Swiss cheese model. Swiss cheese model, by the way, is one of those theoretical models that you want to try and get into your responses to raise the kind of theory marks that you'll get within your answers. And I've got a video on the use of theoretical models. That link is in the description for this video. Anyway, back to this video. So Nepal is your classic example of a convergent continental boundary. It's the boundary that has resulted in the formation of the Himalayas. So the Indian plate moves towards the Eurasian plate at around 45 millimeters per year. But this creates an enormous amount of tectonic strain. So in April 2015, that resulted in the pressure overcoming the force of friction, boom, and leading to a fracture, resulting in a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. Now, crucially, with these plate boundaries, you are going to get a very shallow focal depth, and the focal depth for here was around 8.2 kilometers. So the surface shaking was both violent and sustained. But the high magnitude is only part of the story. The steep topography triggered over 3,000 landslides, a secondary hazard that causes massive destruction. The village of Langtang was hit by a landslide which killed over 300 people. So when discussing the physical environment, it's really important to bring that in as a potential reason why vulnerability might be high. It's a very specific factor to very specific communities in specific physical geography settings. And this is just one of the holes on the Swiss cheese model that lined up with development and governance factors. Other things that you can discuss: governance, building codes were not enforced. Economic, GDP per capita was only $700, meaning very few funds for the retrofitting of these buildings. In terms of your population geography, 80% of the population were rural, and this was a crucial factor. Landslides blocked the only roads available to access these rural villages, meaning search and rescue teams took days or even weeks before reaching the more remote mountain villages. And this delay in what's called the golden hour drastically increased the death toll, which was eventually around 9,000 deaths. You can use Nepal to argue that physical accessibility and physical geography setting are just as important as magnitude and levels of development and governance in determining disaster scale. Okay, next up, it's Haiti. I can't do a tectonics case study video without mentioning Haiti, particularly the 2010 disaster, because there were so many factors that contributed to why this was such a large-scale disaster. We just can't ignore it. So this is your classic example of where Haiti being a lower magnitude hazard than in places like Chile, in places like Japan, but can still lead to larger scales of disaster. And that's because predominantly the reasons why it was such a large scale of disaster are because of levels of development and levels of governance, or the strength of governance, which makes it a perfect example to use with the PAR model. Again, the PAR model is something that I discuss in that theories video, which is in the description if you want to watch it after this one. So it sits on a conservative boundary, which is this one here, where plates move side by side. Naturally, this results in shallow focal depth earthquakes, and the focal depth for the 2010 disaster was 13 kilometers. But crucial to this example is that the epicenter was only 25 kilometers from the capital, Port-au-Prince, which we'll come back to. So to get the top AO1 marks, this case study is about linking it to that theoretical model of the PAR model. So we've got the root cause of low levels of economic development. So the GDP at the time was around 12 billion. This resulted in a dynamic pressure where 72% of the population lived on less than $2 a day. This resulted in an unsafe condition where 90% of the buildings were made from a weak concrete. So no wonder 200,000 homes collapsed during the 7 magnitude earthquake. Not only this, we can also assign the root cause of weak governance. Now, weak governance resulted in a few things. There was the dynamic pressure of a lack of investment in rural areas, which resulted in large-scale rural to urban migration, which resulted in high population densities, so 25% of the population lived in Port-au-Prince. Furthermore, another dynamic pressure from weak governance is the fact that there was a lack of enforcement of building codes and land use planning as well. So not only were the buildings made from a weak concrete, which didn't meet the standards required for an active seismic zone, they were also built on hill slopes. So these properties didn't really stand a chance. Also, in terms of weak governance, Haiti scores very high on the Corruption Perception Index, which meant that it's another indicator really of the fact that there's weak governance. So there was a very poor response effort in the wake of the disaster. There was no one within government to coordinate NGO efforts. All of these things combined led to the large-scale disaster, which was 230,000 deaths. Not to mention the longer-term effects. Because of the large-scale collapse of pretty much most of the properties in Haiti. Some of these properties, some of these buildings were actually jails, and a lot of prisoners escaped these jails when the earthquake hit, and they've not been returned. So if we contrast this event with Chile, which was during the same year, which was a higher magnitude, the death toll was over 400 times greater. However, if you want to talk about the more recent developments in Haiti, we could argue that they've taken a backward step, with the country now largely being controlled by gangs, notably the G9, which is led by a chap who goes by the name of Barbecue. So if another earthquake does hit, we can probably suggest that their vulnerability is probably a little bit higher than it was in 2021. So we'll have to hope that doesn't occur before they've managed to sort out their governance structures. So this is proof that in many settings, it doesn't matter what your mitigation strategies are, you can't build up true resilience without strong governance. Okay, next up, another more recent example, we're looking at the Turkey 2023 earthquake. So let's talk about the physical event itself. So it was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake, followed by a 7.5 magnitude earthquake around 9 hours later. It occurred on a conservative boundary, once again, giving it a shallow focal depth of around 17 kilometers. And this caused violent shaking across 11 provinces. Now, why Turkey is quite useful is because you can't necessarily assign levels of development as a reason for why Turkey developed such a high scale of disaster. This is predominantly down to governance, because Turkey is an emerging economy. So the levels of governance here are probably one of the more useful reasons for why there was a large scale of disaster. So again, it makes it quite a nice one to use with the PAR model, or even the DEGS model if you're looking for something more simple. First up, in 2018, there were 100,000 buildings codes amnesties granted to buildings that didn't meet the required enforcement standards. So that allowed developers to pay a fine or a fee instead of having to completely reconstruct the buildings. So when the earthquake hit, luxury apartments built just a year prior to the earthquake in 2022 just pancaked, proving to be a huge failure in terms of the mitigation phase of the hazard management cycle. So there's another theory that you could bring in with this particular case study here. But governance wasn't just responsible for the lack of building code enforcement. One of the major failures was in the response phase. So President Erdogan had centralized power, removing that power away from the military. The military is the ideal organizational body to respond to earthquake events, but it removed the military's authority to deploy search and rescue teams during the disaster. So they had to wait for the go-ahead from the Turkish Disaster Authority, and that led to a 48-hour delay. To make matters worse, the government blocked Twitter, or Twitter as it was known then, and that was so that the population couldn't go to social media and comment on how poor the response effort was. Trouble with this, though, was that survivors were actually using Twitter to geolocate themselves so they could be located by search and rescue teams when they eventually were deployed. So that again contributed to the significant amount of deaths. So the death toll was around 53,000 for this disaster, and that could have been avoided. And economic losses, again, were around 84 billion, which constituted around 10% of Turkey's GDP at the time. So this is a really useful case study to show that the building codes themselves are not necessarily what's needed to increase resilience. It's actually the enforcement of these building codes. And it can be a perfect example of how political root causes can lead to unsafe conditions. But in addition to that, you've got its utility in terms of the hazard management cycle and the importance of the mitigation phase as well as the response phase. So now we're going to move to probably one of our most recent examples, which is Myanmar 2025. This is one of our cutting edge case studies, okay, right up to date. If you use Myanmar 2025, you're showing the examiner that you're keeping up to date with current events and that you can apply it to theory that is a constant, no matter what year you study the A-Level Geography spec, which is the hallmark of a top tier geography student. The ones aiming for A's and A stars should look to include this within their responses. And this also is your absolute go-to for a place context evaluation. Now, that idea of a place context evaluation is covered in another one of my videos where I talk about how you can score full marks in Tectonics 12 markers. And it's all about that idea of the wheel of AO2 and how you can generate ideas for your evaluative points. So again, I've put the link in the description for that video. So again, Myanmar is one of those that you can use with the Swiss cheese model. There's a lot of very kind of place context specific factors that all lined up to produce the results or the scale of disaster that was experienced in Myanmar. So let's consider the tectonic setting first. Again, it's one of those conservative boundaries and the fault line runs right through the center of the country. The earthquake, a 7.2 magnitude, had a focal depth of just 10 kilometers, again, not providing much room for the dissipation of energy. But the physical event 1% was only a fraction of the problem. To get those high-level marks, we need to bring in place context-specific factors. So the timing of the event and the religious context are two really interesting points that you can bring into this disaster. The quake hit in the early evening, during a period of prayer. And because this is a deeply religious setting, thousands of people were in unreinforced pagodas and temples. So this kind of time of day factor and the religious context meant that the occupancy of high-risk, non-aseismic buildings was high, leading to a huge spike in the initial casualties. But this is where the PAR model starts to get interesting. Myanmar was already in a state of civil war. Governance was non-existent in rural areas, so government funds that should have been used for resilience and capacity building had been diverted to military spending. And then when the 6.4 magnitude aftershock hit just 12 hours later, the remaining structures and the confidence of the population completely collapsed. And search and rescue in some areas was hampered because NGO workers didn't feel safe to go into these conflict zones. The death toll reached over 4,000, and it was made worse by the fact that there was a lack of heavy lifting equipment which was seized for the civil war efforts. So you can use Myanmar to suggest that those human factors, like religious practices and political instability, internal political instability, are just as critical as the magnitude. Okay, next up, we're moving to BAM in Iran. Another commercial break. If you feel like you need some last-minute assistance just before the exam, for the second year in a row, I'm going to be running my last-minute content masterclasses, and these will be on the weekend before your 12th of May exam. It's a 2-day intensive deep dive into the absolute core theory across all of the modules: tectonics, coasts, carbon, and water cycles. Because remember, you've done the content phase, now you're in the exam technique phase. What people sometimes need is just that last-minute overview of absolutely everything, one big picture overview before you jump into that 12th of May exam. So right now, you can secure your spot on that 2-day masterclass for $14.99. But fair warning, May the 1st, the price jumps to $24.99. So you've got a window right now to save yourself a tenner, to get that A-star content locked in nice and early. So don't wait until the night before to realise that you've forgotten what an input and an output is, or how to describe longshore drift, or why the slow geological cycle is just one big negative feedback mechanism. Click the link in my bio and grab the early bird offer and join what was last year over 100 students in the ultimate Paper 1 masterclass. Secure your knowledge, save your cash. Let's get back to it with BAM Iran. Okay, BAM Iran 2003, again, is another really useful one for the Swiss cheese model, where it suggests that multiple factors contributed to the overall outcome. We'll start with the physical. It was a 6.6 magnitude earthquake, and that is because, again, it's on a strike slip fault or a conservative fault, producing a shallow focal depth of just 7 kilometers, but with an epicenter directly beneath an ancient city. So here's how all the holes lined up in our Swiss cheese model. First up was the structural vulnerability. So BAM was famous for its 2,000-year-old buildings. Most houses were built of unreinforced mud brick or adobe, and these structures have zero flexibility. So when the S waves and the L waves hit, they didn't sway at all, they just simply disintegrated, leading to 90% of the city's buildings collapsing, trapping thousands in suffocating debris. Next up, we've got the timing of the event. So the earthquake hit at 5:26 a.m. on a Friday, is the weekend in Iran, so people were at home, in bed, and probably in some form of deep sleep. If this had happened at noon, the death toll may well have been halved. And to make it worse, it was midwinter, so temperatures in the evening were below freezing. So that meant that many of those who survived died from hypothermia before rescuers could reach them. And then the final hole was the collapse of the response phase. Because the epicenter was underneath the city, a lot of local hospitals collapsed, and over 50% of the medical professionals were killed. That meant there was no local capacity to treat the survivors, contributing immensely to the 26,000 death toll. So nearly 30% of the population gone in seconds. So this essentially is the alignment of old infrastructure, bad timing, and cold conditions. And that concludes our kind of scale of disaster being made larger by increased vulnerability or decreased resilience. What we're going to do now is move on to what are our tectonic settings, or some of our tectonic settings that are actually handling earthquakes very well. So Japan is the most seismically prepared nation on the planet. They have a network of over 1,000 seismometers linked to a real-time warning system. So during the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, which was a 9 magnitude, a warning was sent out 8 seconds after the first P wave was detected, giving the residents a 60-second warning. That was enough time to stop the high-speed bullet trains, to shut down gas lines, and get millions of people either out of buildings or under sturdy desks. But this resilience isn't just about tech, it's about education. So every September the 1st is National Disaster Prevention Day. So from the age of about kindergarten, citizens are educated in evacuation procedures. And this culture of preparedness means that when a disaster strikes or is about to strike, the response is both rapid but orderly. Also, the government, with its very high levels of development, can deploy around yen 1 trillion in emergency funds almost instantly, stopping that delay from receiving aid from around the world. So that recovery phase starts within days rather than weeks, allowing them to return to optimal economic output, which is something that can obviously reduce the longer-term impacts of a hazard. So Japan is the perfect example to use with the Parkes model, showing a very rapid return to normality. Now, to get those higher AO1 marks, you also have to talk about hazard-resistant design. Japan uses mainly base isolators and tuned mass dampeners, which are huge weights that kind of counter the sway. Essentially, methods that will absorb the tension and compression forces produced by surface L waves. Now, because of these measures that were put in place, that 9-magnitude earthquake only resulted in 10% of the 16,000 deaths. So most were due to the tsunami that followed. Now, tsunamis I'm going to cover in a completely separate video, which is on the way. So use Japan to argue that both wealth and strength of governance can significantly reduce vulnerability. So the death toll of 1,600 deaths, while large and equal to that earthquake in Chile, is still quite small considering the levels of development, the amount of infrastructure in place in Japan that could potentially present a hazard. So contrast this with Haiti to show the development and governance gap. Japan proves that humans can mitigate magnitude. Okay, now we move on to Christchurch, New Zealand. Christchurch is your go-to example for the response phase on the hazard management cycle and the specific geological hazard of liquefaction. It's also a brilliant case study for showing how a country can have quite high resilience, but still suffer those large-scale economic shocks, if you like. So February 2011, Christchurch was hit by a 6.3 magnitude earthquake. Not massive, but still enough to cause damage. But there was a shallow focal depth of around 5 kilometers, and the epicenter was just 10 kilometers away from the city. So this is a great example to use with the hazard risk equation when we've got that factor of exposure. Exposure being, how many people are in close proximity to the actual hazard itself, and that can increase risk. Now, this earthquake produced some of the highest ground acceleration ever recorded, and it literally threw buildings into the air. Now, because of this high ground acceleration, this high ground shaking, this was where liquefaction really became a problem. So Christchurch is built on loose, water-saturated silt. So the shaking caused the ground to behave like a liquid, destroying around 10,000 homes and undermining the foundations of the entire Central Business District, or CBD, and led to over 400,000 tons of silt flooding the streets in Christchurch. So this is a great example of how the geological setting can actually undermine even the best of building codes. But despite that damage, the social impacts anyway were mitigated effectively by the response phase. So again, a really good example of where you can bring the hazard management cycle into your responses. So New Zealand utilised the concept of the golden hour, and that's the critical first 60 minutes where medical interventions are the most effective and dramatically increase survival rates. So within 2 hours of the hazard itself, the national government declared a state of national emergency, or a national state of emergency. 15 countries sent search and rescue teams immediately. And because of this high-level governance, the death toll was kept to around 185, despite over 50% of the buildings in the CBD being severely damaged. Now, the economic cost was pretty enormous. It was around 40 billion, which was roughly around 20% of New Zealand's GDP at the time. But because New Zealand is a well-developed economy, with high what's called insurance penetration, which means there's high levels of insurance, the recovery was a lot more rapid than in less developed economies. So 80% of the costs were covered by insurance, essentially, which is a great example for how we can modify the loss. So this is an essential point, isn't it, for your 12 markers, particularly when you're talking about levels of development influencing the capacity to recover. Again, one of those areas on the hazard management cycle, but also you could talk about that with reference to the Parkes model. So Christchurch, fantastic example for geological setting, increasing the risk, particularly of economic disaster, but mainly because of the levels of governance and development, the ability of this nation to then respond and recover, that's the thing that brings down the disaster scale over the longer term. Okay, on to the USA. So the USA, specifically California, is the perfect example for how tectonic vulnerability can be overcome by extreme levels of wealth. This is where we see the most expensive, high-tech mitigation strategies on the planet. So use this example to discuss base isolation systems, cross-bracing, and the economic capacity to provide insurance and retrofitting. So in the US, hazard management isn't just a government priority, it's a corporate one as well. So California sits on the San Andreas Fault, a 1,300-kilometer conservative boundary. But because the tech industry is centered here, the economic stakes are in the trillions. And this has led to some of the most advanced hazard-resistant design in the world. Take the Apple headquarters. This entire building sits on 800 massive base isolators. Think of these as your giant shock absorbers that almost decouple the building from the earth. They work a bit like that. So my hand is the building, and then the ground is shaking underneath. Look at the base isolation. The top hand is barely moving. So when the quake hits, the ground can move around 4 feet underneath, which means that the building barely moves. So the total cost, roughly around $5 billion, with wider Silicon Valley efforts reaching in the tens of billions. Now, beyond base isolation, the US also uses cross-bracing. These are like steel X-frames like this that prevent the buildings from twisting like that. So one will be held rigid and the other will be slack, so it can cause that movement. So anything where there's the allowance of movement within a building, that's some of that energy. Now, the preferred method is obviously base isolators, but these are significantly more expensive. But the real resilience is financial in the US. So the US has incredibly high insurance penetration, as we discussed before. So in a disaster, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, can deploy billions in aid, while private insurance allows buildings to be rebuilt almost instantly. So again, this reduces that recovery phase of the hazard management cycle. So while the 1994 Northridge 6.7 magnitude earthquake caused around 20 billion in damages, the death toll was kept around 57. Compare that to BAM's 6.6, resulting in 26,000, and you've got a really good idea of how levels of development and hazard-resistant design compares to where there is none of a similar magnitude. It's really useful to have two similar magnitude events. These are the best ones to contrast. So this is the ultimate proof that money can buy both social and economic safety. What I'm going to bring in now is Ecuador. So Ecuador is a fantastic case study to demonstrate how even lower middle income countries can successfully transition from vulnerability to resilience. And it shows that you don't need a 25 billion investment into base isolators to achieve that increased coping capacity. Ecuador, like Chile, sits within the ring of fire where we see 81% of the world's most intense earthquakes. So in 2016, it experienced a huge 7.8 magnitude earthquake, and the shaking was felt as far away as Colombia. Now, during this 2016 disaster, over 673 people died and caused around $3 billion in damage. But Ecuador didn't just rebuild. They did what's often called building back better. So again, this is one of those perfect examples. When you use the Parks model, sometimes you have those curves where here is the normality, there is the dip, and then they build back better, so they have a new normality. So they strictly enforced what was called the Ecuadorian construction. So this was a government-led mandate that required all new social housing to meet a certain seismic standard, even in lower income rural areas. So this is the benefit of being a socialist economic setting. So resilience in Ecuador isn't about expensive base isolators, it's about appropriate technology. So they've championed the use of reinforced bamboo and localized confined masonry. So techniques that are cheap but flexible enough to survive high magnitude earthquakes. So this is the perfect example of reducing physical vulnerability on a budget, focusing on the mitigation phase of the hazard management cycle. They've also invested heavily in their risk management body, which runs community-led evacuation drills, just like in Japan on the 1st of September every year. So you can use Ecuador to argue that development is actually a spectrum, and it proves that lower middle-income countries can actually close the vulnerability gap through specialized design and budget-friendly development, if you like, or budget-friendly aseismic designs. So it provides that perfect middle ground case study between Haiti and Japan. And then finally, what we're doing is we're heading to Mexico, which is a similar setting, and we'll look at how they've mastered the art of building on jelly, if you like. Like Christchurch, Mexico is an essential case study for geology-specific vulnerability. It's the best way to show the examiner that you can show how the ground can amplify disaster scale, but also how high-level engineering can solve it. Mexico is somewhat of a tectonic anomaly. It was built on the dry bed of Lake Texcoco. So this means that the city sits on hundreds of meters of soft, water-saturated silts and clays. So when seismic waves hit, they don't just pass through, they slow down and amplify. So the ground behaves like a bowl of jelly. So this is liquefaction and what's called seismic resonance at its most extreme. So in 1985, an 8 magnitude earthquake struck. So because of the soft soil, the shaking lasted for nearly 2 minutes. And this resonance hit buildings that were around 6 to 15 stories extremely hard, causing them to vibrate at the same frequency as the ground. They collapsed and over 10,000 people died. So how did they solve this? By creating what were called friction piles. So take the Torre, once the tallest building in Latin America. So it's built on 100 steel and concrete piles that sink 40 meters deep into the soil below the soft clay. And it uses 98 seismic dampeners that act like giant shock absorbers, which meant that during the 2017 7.1 earthquake, the building didn't suffer a single broken window, whereas older structures collapsed. Mexico also has what's called SASMEX, Earthquake Early Warning System. It gives Mexico up to 60 seconds of notice before any shaking starts. So use Mexico to consider that physical geography determines the type of hazard mitigation, that you can't just build strong. You have to build for specific geology in certain contexts, making it the ultimate example for site-specific resilience. And that's it. That's the series. From the $25 billion strategies in the USA to the mud brick tragedy of Bam, Iran, you now have the facts, the figures, the AO1 to score those level 3 responses in your 12 markers. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video, which is going to be volcano focused.